Hi, I'm Emma. I'm 31 years old. And the night that changed everything wasn't a birthday, wasn't a wedding. It was my father's retirement dinner. I thought it would be a celebration. Laughter, old stories, wine glasses clinking. A proud daughter, sitting at the table, waiting for her name to be mentioned with love. But then, he picked up the mic. And in front of everyone, my uncles, my cousins, my childhood neighbors, he humiliated me. You're a disappointment, Emma. You're selfish. You don't belong in this family. Please leave. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I froze. The worst part? No one said anything. Not a word. Just silence. Until my husband stood up. Not angrily. Not dramatically. But with a calmness that cut through the room like thunder. And what he said turned shame into strength. And a broken dinner into the beginning of something I never expected. This is the story of the night I was disowned. And how love stood taller than blood. The room was glowing. Golden chandeliers sparkled like stars. The long wooden tables were covered in white silk cloth, fine china, and tall wine glasses. Laughter floated through the air like warm wind. Everyone looked happy. Everyone, except me. I stood near the corner, trying to smile. This was my father's big night, his retirement dinner after 40 long years in the military. He had been a colonel. Strict. Respected. And feared. He loved honor. He loved tradition. But most of all, he loved control. I looked over at him. Dressed in a sharp black suit, his chest full of medals. His salt and pepper hair slicked back, his smile perfect. He stood tall, shaking hands, giving short laughs. He looked proud. Important. He hadn't spoken to me all night. I was never the child he wanted. I didn't join the military like my brother. I didn't become a doctor like he had hoped. I married young. I chose love. You threw your future away, he had told me the day I got married. You were supposed to make me proud. I still remembered his words. They stuck in my heart like thorns. But I had never argued. I had never raised my voice. I only stayed quiet. Always quiet. As I stood in the corner, my husband gently touched my hand. Are you okay? He whispered. I nodded, lying. Yes. Just a little tired. He looked at me with concern. His name was Ethan, calm eyes, steady hands. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. But he had one thing most men didn't, loyalty. He believed in me when no one else did. That's why I loved him. He smiled softly. I'm here if you need me. That moment gave me a little strength. But I didn't know what storm was coming next. A sharp fork hit a glass. Cling, cling, cling. All eyes turned toward the center. My father stood with a microphone in his hand. Ladies and gentlemen, he began. Thank you for being here tonight. His voice was strong, clear. Everyone clapped. This dinner is not just for me, he continued. It's for the people who helped shape my career. My family. My friends. My brothers in arms. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. And of course, my son. My pride. My legacy. James. Everyone clapped again. My brother stood and gave a proud salute. Father smiled. A man who followed in my footsteps, who carries our name with honor. Then, he looked at me. His eyes went cold. And then, he said slowly, there's my daughter. The room fell silent. I felt my heart race. My father took a deep breath and said, she was once full of potential. But she gave it all up. She ran away from discipline. From duty. From dignity. Gasps in the room. People looked at each other. I stood frozen. She married a man with no rank, no purpose, no future. She ignored my advice. My warnings. And tonight. He looked directly at me, his voice turning sharp. I want her to leave this room. Right now. My mouth went dry. I won't let this celebration be stained with failure, he added. I felt 200 eyes turn toward me. My hands shook. My throat tightened. 1,000 emotions screamed inside me, shame, fear, heartbreak, rage. But I couldn't move. I was stuck in place like a broken statue. The room was quiet. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the music had stopped. I looked at my mother. She lowered her eyes. My brother looked away. No one came to stop him. No one said a word. It was like I was invisible. Or worse, a disgrace. I could barely breathe. And then I heard a chair slide. Hi, I'm Emma. I'm 31 years old. And the night that changed everything wasn't a birthday. Wasn't a wedding. It was my father's retirement dinner. I thought it would be a celebration. Laughter, old stories, wine glasses clinking. A proud daughter, sitting at the table, waiting for her name to be mentioned with love. But then, he picked up the mic. And in front of everyone, my uncles, my cousins, my childhood neighbors, he humiliated me. You're a disappointment, Emma. You're selfish. You don't belong in this family. Please leave. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I froze. The worst part. No one said anything. Not a word. Just silence. Until my husband stood up. Not angrily. Not dramatically. But with a calmness that cut through the room like thunder. And what he said turned shame into strength. And a broken dinner into the beginning of something I never expected. This is the story of the night I was disowned. And how love stood taller than blood. The room was glowing. Golden chandeliers sparkled like stars. The long wooden tables were covered in white silk cloth, fine china, and tall wine glasses. Laughter floated through the air like warm wind. Everyone looked happy. Everyone, except me. I stood near the corner, trying to smile. This was my father's big night, his retirement dinner after 40 long years in the military. He had been a colonel. Strict. Respected. And feared. He loved honor. He loved tradition. But most of all, he loved control. I looked over at him. Dressed in a sharp black suit, his chest full of medals. His salt and pepper hair slicked back, his smile perfect. He stood tall, shaking hands, giving short laughs. He looked proud. Important. He hadn't spoken to me all night. I was never the child he wanted. I didn't join the military like my brother. I didn't become a doctor like he had hoped. I married young. I chose love. You threw your future away, he had told me the day I got married. You were supposed to make me proud. I still remembered his words. They stuck in my heart like thorns. But I had never argued. I had never raised my voice. I only stayed quiet. Always quiet. As I stood in the corner, my husband gently touched my hand. Are you okay? He whispered. I nodded, lying. Yes. Just a little tired. He looked at me with concern. His name was Ethan, calm eyes, steady hands. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. But he had one thing most men didn't, loyalty. He believed in me when no one else did. That's why I loved him. He smiled softly. I'm here if you need me. That moment gave me a little strength. But I didn't know what storm was coming next. A sharp fork hit a glass. Cling, cling, cling. All eyes turned toward the center. My father stood with a microphone in his hand. Ladies and gentlemen, he began. Thank you for being here tonight. His voice was strong, clear. Everyone clapped. This dinner is not just for me, he continued. It's for the people who helped shape my career. My family. My friends. My brothers in arms. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. And of course, my son. My pride. My legacy. James. Everyone clapped again. My brother stood and gave a proud salute. Father smiled. A man who followed in my footsteps, who carries our name with honor. Then, he looked at me. His eyes went cold. And then, he said slowly, there's my daughter. The room fell silent. I felt my heart race. My father took a deep breath and said, she was once full of potential. But she gave it all up. She ran away from discipline. From duty. From dignity. Gasps in the room. People looked at each other. I stood frozen. She married a man with no rank, no purpose, no future. She ignored my advice. My warnings. And tonight. He looked directly at me, his voice turning sharp. I want her to leave this room. Right now. My mouth went dry. I won't let this celebration be stained with failure, he added. I felt 200 eyes turn toward me. My hands shook. My throat tightened. 1,000 emotions screamed inside me, shame, fear, heartbreak, rage. But I couldn't move. I was stuck in place like a broken statue. The room was quiet. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the music had stopped. I looked at my mother. She lowered her eyes. My brother looked away. No one came to stop him. No one said a word. It was like I was invisible. Or worse, a disgrace. I could barely breathe. And then I heard a chair slide. That mattered now. Ethan opened the passenger door for me. As I sat inside, the silence in the car, that mattered now. Ethan opened the passenger door for me. As I sat inside, the silence in the car, I was too afraid to lose his approval. But I see now, his approval isn't worth it if it costs us our humanity. He closed the notebook. I want to be a better brother. If you'll let me. I stood up. Walked toward him. And I hugged him. It was the kind of hug we hadn't shared since childhood. That night, we sat at their dinner table like a family should. No judgment. No harsh words. No silence filled with anger. Just laughter. Stories. Forgiveness. Ethan held my hand under the table, his thumb gently tracing circles on my palm. My heart felt full in a way it hadn't in years. Not because everything was fixed, but because something had started to heal. A few days later, I was scrolling through the local news when something caught my eye. A feature story, a full-page article with the headline, "Retired Colonel Reflects on Family, Legacy, and Discipline." It was my father. He had given an interview to the town newspaper. I skimmed the words, rigid sentences about tradition, strength, and the cost of weakness. Then, a line that made my blood run cold. Sometimes, we must cut off the broken branch to save the tree. That was about me. I felt the old sting rise in my chest again. But this time, it didn't reach my heart. Because this time, I knew better. I closed the article and took a deep breath. Ethan walked into the room, holding a mug of tea. "Bad news?" he asked gently. I shook my head. "No. Just old words from an old man." He nodded, sitting beside me. You don't have to carry his opinions anymore, he said. He doesn't get to decide your value. I know, I whispered. And for the first time, I really meant it. A few weeks later, a letter arrived by mail. Not from my father. From the Veterans Council. It was an invitation to a ceremony, one where my father was being honored for his service. A Lifetime Achievement Award. I turned the envelope over in my hands. It was formal. Official. At the bottom it read, "Family of the honoree are welcome and encouraged to attend." I felt a weight in my chest. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Anger. Resentment. Pity. But what I felt was stillness. I placed the envelope on the table. Ethan walked over and picked it up. He read it quietly and then asked, "Do you want to go?" I didn't answer immediately. Finally, I said, "I don't want to go for him. I want to go for me." Ethan nodded. "Then let's go." The auditorium was filled with men and women in uniform. Medals gleamed under stage lights. Flags waved quietly in the air conditioning. My father stood at the front, tall and proud as always. His expression was serious, unreadable. I stayed in the back, unnoticed. When they announced his name, the crowd rose in applause. He stepped up to the podium, accepted the medal, and began to speak. His voice was the same, strong, precise, commanding. But there was no warmth. No mention of family. No sign that he had changed. And somehow, that didn't bother me. Because I no longer expected it. As he finished his speech, the crowd stood again. Ethan touched my arm gently. "Ready?" I nodded. We left quietly before the lights came back on. We didn't say hello. We didn't wait to be seen. We didn't need to be. Outside the auditorium was a small stone bench. I sat down, letting the wind play with the hem of my dress. Ethan joined me. "You okay?" he asked. "I think I am," I said honestly. He looked at me with a half smile. "You didn't go up there. Didn't confront him." "No," I said. "Because I didn't come here to fight. I came here to let go." He nodded, looking proud. And I felt something change deep inside me, a release. That night, I sat down at my desk and pulled out a piece of paper. And for the first time, I wrote a letter to him. "Dad, I don't write this to change your mind. I don't write this to ask for love or recognition or approval. I write this to close the chapter. You were my father. But you were not always my protector. You were my commander. But rarely my supporter. Still, I am thankful. Because your silence taught me to find my own voice. Your rejection taught me to embrace those who lift me. And your coldness made me appreciate warmth. I don't hate you. I don't even pity you. I simply release you. Goodbye, Dad. Emma." I folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and burned it in the fireplace. Watching the flames take it away felt healing. 2 months later, I received an email that changed everything. A local women's leadership group had heard about what happened at the dinner. Someone had shared part of Ethan's speech. It had gone viral, quietly, on a small blog, but it reached people. They invited me to speak. Me. Not as a soldier. Not as a daughter of a colonel. But as Emma Hale, the woman who stood through the storm and didn't fall. Standing behind that podium, I felt nervous. But not afraid. The room was filled with women, young, old, confident, quiet. I looked into their eyes and said, "My name is Emma. And I used to believe I was a disappointment. Until I realized I had only disappointed the wrong people." Soft laughter. Nods. Tears. I continued. We don't need to be someone else's version of worthy. We just need to be true to ourselves, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That day, I didn't just tell my story. I claimed it. A week after the speech, I received a message on social media. The profile picture was gray, no image. Just a name. C.R. Hale. My heart skipped. It was my father. I hesitated before opening the message. I didn't know what I expected: an apology, a lecture, another insult. But the message was short. I saw your speech. I don't agree with all of it. But you spoke well. Dad. That was it. No warmth. No softness. No, I'm proud of you. But for some reason, it didn't hurt. Because this time, I didn't need him to clap for me. I was already standing. A few days later, my brother James texted me. He's been quieter since he saw your video. More tired. Less angry. I don't think he knows how to process who you've become. I replied. He doesn't have to. I'm not asking for that. James answered. Still, I think you should meet. One last time. Just you and him. I stared at the message. My fingers hovered above the screen for a long time. And finally, I wrote. Okay. Just once. We agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop outside town. I arrived first. Ethan didn't come with me. I needed to do this alone. When my father walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked older. Smaller. Like a balloon that had slowly lost air. He sat down across from me. No handshake. No hug. Just a nod. Emma, he said. Dad, I replied. We sat in silence for a full minute. Then he spoke. You've changed. I had to, I said calmly. He nodded. Another pause. I thought I was protecting you, he said finally. By being tough. By pushing you. You weren't protecting me, I replied. You were controlling me. He looked away. I didn't know another way, he said. I believe that, I said. But it doesn't make it right. He looked at me again, not with anger but something softer. I watched your speech, he said. You sounded powerful. I am, I replied. He nodded slowly. You don't need me anymore, do you? No, I said gently. But I forgive you anyway. We stood up. He looked like he wanted to say something more, but didn't know how. I extended my hand. He took it. It wasn't warm. It wasn't a happy ending. But it was a kind one. And sometimes, that's enough. I returned home to find Ethan in the garden, planting fresh flowers. When he saw me, he wiped his hands and walked over. How did it go? He asked. I closed the book, I said. He nodded, took my hand, and kissed it. And that was the end of a chapter, not with fireworks, not with drama, but with peace. A full year passed. My life had changed in quiet, beautiful ways. I was invited to speak in schools, women's shelters, even corporate events. People wanted to hear my story, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Ethan's company had grown, and we worked on a foundation together, one that helped women rebuild confidence after emotional abuse. I had found purpose in the very pain that once made me feel invisible. And now, I was seen. One night, I sat in bed and wrote another letter. But this time, not to my father. This one was to me. Dear younger Emma. You will go through storms that shake your soul. You will hear words that break your heart. You will wonder if love is something you have to earn. But you'll learn that love, real love, lifts you. That pain can shape you, not destroy you. That silence can teach you, not define you. And one day, you'll rise. Not for them. For yourself. I'm proud of you. Future Emma. It was my birthday. Not a big one, not one of those milestone ages. Just a simple day in April with soft rain on the windows and the smell of coffee in the air. Ethan surprised me with breakfast in bed, blueberry pancakes and a hand-drawn card. He never bought fancy things. He made them. And they always meant more. Inside the card, he'd written, "To the woman who turned storms into strength. I've never been more honored to walk beside anyone in my life." I held the card to my chest and closed my eyes. Because now, I had everything I had once begged for, not from the world, but from within. James called later that day. He asked if we'd come by for dinner again, just him, Rachel, and the kids. This time, my mother would be there too. "She's been asking about you a lot," James said. "She brings you up every time we talk." I smiled. "We'll be there." Their house was warm as ever. Kids ran through the hallway, squealing with joy. Rachel hugged me tight at the door. "You look so peaceful," she said. "Like a woman who finally knows she's enough." I chuckled, surprised. "You can see that?" "Oh, honey," she said. "It's all over your face." My mother was in the kitchen, helping with salad. She looked up as I entered, her eyes watery. "You came," she whispered. I nodded. "Of course I did." She stepped forward and hugged me, the kind of hug I hadn't received from her since I was a little girl crying after a nightmare. And in that kitchen, with simple food and real laughter, I felt like I had finally come home. Later that evening, after dinner and laughter and stories from our childhood, my mother sat beside me on the porch swing. "I think he loved you," she said quietly, "but he didn't know how to show it." I nodded. "That doesn't excuse it," I said gently. She shook her head. "No, it doesn't. But I think it hurt him, that you didn't turn out like him. He thought love was control. And when you stepped away, it felt like betrayal." I sighed. "I don't need him to apologize anymore. I've already forgiven him." She looked surprised. "Even after everything?" I turned to her and said, "Forgiveness isn't something I gave him for his sake. I gave it for mine." 3 months later, we got the call. Colonel Richard Hale had passed away in his sleep. No big funeral. Just a quiet burial arranged by the Veterans Council. James invited me to come. I thought about it for days. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be certain I was going for the right reasons. And then I went. The cemetery was quiet. The wind moved gently through the trees, and the sky was gray with soft light. I stood at his grave alone, while James and the others gave me space. There was no grand speech. No flowers in my hand. Just a small letter I had written the night before. I knelt, placed it on the grass, and whispered, "I tried, Dad. I tried so hard to be what you wanted. But I was always just me. And maybe that was never going to be enough for you. But it's more than enough for me." I stood up, wiped my cheek, and walked away. That day, I didn't cry out of grief. I cried because I was free. 6 months later, I stood on stage again, this time in front of over 500 people. The backdrop read, "Voices that rise, women who rebuilt themselves." I wasn't just a speaker now. I was the closing keynote. I looked at the audience and said, "I used to believe silence was safety. That obedience was the only way to be loved. But now I know, silence can be a prison. And obedience, when forced, is not respect, it's fear." The crowd leaned in. But love, real love, stands up. Real love walks beside you, even when the world turns away. And sometimes, love looks like a husband pulling back a chair. And standing when no one else does. I paused, letting the words settle. You don't have to wait for someone else to see your worth. See it yourself. That's where freedom begins. After the keynote, people lined up to speak with me. Young girls. Elderly women. A few men, too, quiet, thoughtful. Some cried. Some simply said thank you. But almost all of them said the same thing. I thought I was alone. That night, on the ride home, I sat in the passenger seat beside Ethan, holding his hand in the dark. The streetlights passed overhead in gold flickers. I looked over at him and said, "You know what I'm starting to believe." He glanced at me with a smile. What? That maybe the worst thing that ever happened to me was the best thing that ever happened for me. He nodded gently. You turned it into something powerful. No, I said. We did. A few months later, we launched it officially. The Hale Foundation for Women's Voices. The name made people ask, was it named after my father? No. It was named after me. Emma Hale. The woman who lost her voice and then found it again. The foundation provided free counseling for women recovering from emotional abuse, public speaking programs for survivors, small business grants for women rebuilding their lives. And every story that passed through our doors reminded me, this pain wasn't just mine. It was shared. And that meant it could also be healed. It was a rainy afternoon when I felt strange. Not sick. Just different. I told Ethan. He gave me a curious look. Are you late? He asked gently. I blinked. Then we both laughed nervously. We weren't trying. In fact, we'd stopped thinking about it years ago, after the failed IVF, the quiet heartbreak, the silent acceptance. But a week later, 2 pink lines appeared. I sat on the bathroom floor, holding the test in both hands, shaking. Ethan knelt beside me, his eyes wide with emotion. I thought we closed that door, I whispered. Maybe, he said. But maybe life left it slightly open, just for us. Pregnancy changed me. Not just physically, but emotionally. I began to read old journals. I began to write letters to our unborn child. Letters full of promises. I will see you. I will never make you feel invisible. I will listen, even when I don't understand. You will never have to earn my love. It will be yours from the start. I knew I would make mistakes. All parents do. But mine wouldn't be the kind that shattered someone's spirit. They would be the kind we grow from together. We painted the nursery soft green. Not blue. Not pink. Just peace. We filled the shelves with books. We hung words on the walls. You are enough. You are loved. You are seen. And one quiet night, as I rested my head on Ethan's shoulder, I asked, what if it's a girl? He smiled. Then she's going to change the world. I looked at the stars through the window and whispered, let's name her Hope. Because that's what she was. Not just a child. A promise. Before the birth, I went through my memory box, old photographs, letters, trinkets from college, my wedding ring box, the first drawing Ethan ever gave me. And then I saw it. A torn envelope. My father's last letter. I stared at it for a long time. Not with anger. Not with sadness. But with something, like softness. I placed it back in the box, not to forget it, but to remember how far I had come. Because sometimes, the scars we carry become maps. Signs of where we've been, and how strong we've become along the way. It was a calm morning. Light rain tapped softly on the windows. The hospital room was quiet, filled with gentle beeping, soft lights, and Ethan's steady voice whispering, you've got this. The labor was long. Exhausting. There were moments I thought I would break. But I didn't. because I remembered everything I had survived before this. And when she arrived, tiny, red-faced, eyes squinting at the world, I cried harder than I ever had before. Not from pain. From overwhelming, breath-stealing, heart-bursting love. They placed her in my arms, wrapped in a white blanket with a tiny hat that barely fit her head. I looked down at her face. So small. So new. So full of possibility. And in that moment, something shifted in me. Like all the old wounds turned into something useful. Like every rejection, every word that once tore me down, had led me here. To this. To her. I whispered her name, Hope. She opened her eyes. And for the first time in my life, I saw someone look back at me with nothing but pure, unfiltered trust. Ethan held her like she was the most sacred thing he had ever touched. He cried. He didn't try to hide it. He looked at me and whispered, "She has your eyes." "No," I smiled. "She has your heart." He kissed my forehead, and for a moment the world outside that hospital room didn't exist. No history. No pain. No legacy to fix. Just the three of us. Our own beginning. A few nights later, while Hope slept on my chest and Ethan snored softly beside us, I picked up a pen and wrote. "Dear Hope. You won't remember this night, but I will. You are just a few days old. You sleep with your tiny fists curled like you're holding on to dreams. You don't know the world yet, its noise, its scars, its sharp corners. But you will. And when you do, I want you to remember something: you are never alone. I walked through fire before I ever held you. But it made me strong enough to carry you now. I will never make you prove your worth. You were born worthy. I will never ask you to shrink to fit someone's idea of perfection. You are enough just as you are. And even if one day you stumble, fall, or question your place in the world, remember, you come from strength. Not from a bloodline. From choice. From love. I will always stand beside you, the way your father once stood for me. With all my heart. Mom." Months passed. Hope grew. She smiled like sunshine and cried like thunder. One soft spring morning, I took her on a walk. Past the park. Past the old school. And finally, to the cemetery. Ethan stayed behind, giving me space. I carried her in a sling, close to my heart, and stood once more at the grave of Colonel Richard Hale. I looked down at the stone. A man of duty, discipline, and strength. I gently lowered Hope's blanket so her face peeked out. "This is where your grandfather rests," I whispered. "You'll never know him. And that's okay." I placed a small daisy beside the headstone. I came here angry once. Then sad. Then indifferent. But today, I came grateful. I smiled down at Hope. Because without his rejection, I might never have found my own voice. Or your father. Or you. Hope will grow up never fearing silence. She will never flinch at raised voices. She will know that love does not come with conditions, only with presence. Her story will not begin with wounds, but with healing. And if one day she asks me about my past, I'll tell her the truth. But I will end with this. My story wasn't about how I was broken. It was about how I rebuilt. And how you, my darling, are the proof. That light always finds a way through. Time moved quietly after that. Hope grew from a newborn into a giggling toddler who chased butterflies in the garden and called Ethan Dada with a grin that could melt stone. I kept writing. I kept speaking. And I kept healing, not in loud, dramatic ways, but in soft, steady ripples. Some wounds don't close in a single moment. They close gently, over years, like a sunrise that doesn't rush. One evening, while Hope napped, my mother and I sat on the porch with warm tea in our hands. She watched the wind move through the trees and said, "You're nothing like I was at your age. I raised an eyebrow. Is that a compliment? She smiled. It's a confession. She turned to me. When I was your age, I was still afraid of him. Still trying to do everything right. Still walking on eggshells in my own home. I reached for her hand. You survived him, I said softly. And you taught me how not to repeat it. She nodded, eyes misty. I'm proud of you, Emma. This time, when she said it, I believed her. One day, Hope ran up to me holding an old photo. It was the one photo I hadn't removed from my memory box, a black and white image of me as a child, sitting on my father's shoulders at the park. Who's this, Mama? I looked at it carefully. That's me, I said, when I was your age. And the man, she asked. That was someone who helped me become strong, I said honestly. Even if he didn't mean to. She tilted her head. He looks like he's smiling. He was, I whispered. Back then. She nodded and skipped away. I placed the photo on the bookshelf, not hidden anymore. Just part of the journey. On my 40th birthday, Ethan planned a surprise celebration. Friends. Family. Laughter. Even James gave a short, hilarious toast about our childhood. Then Ethan stood up. He tapped his glass and said, I'd like to say something about the woman I married. I smiled nervously. Careful, I joked. Everyone laughed. But then, he grew serious. I once saw her get humiliated in a room full of people, and walk out of that room with her head held high. I've seen her build herself back up from ashes. Not just once but over and over. He turned toward me. You think I stood for you that night, Emma. But the truth is, you've been standing for me every day since. The room fell quiet. Then applause. Then tears. And I realized, this was the kind of family I had longed for. And I had built it. A few years later, Hope stood nervously on the school stage. It was her turn for the class speech. She looked out at the audience, searching. Her eyes met mine. I gave her the same small nod Ethan once gave me, years ago, when I was trembling behind a podium. She took a breath and said, My name is Hope Hale, and I'm here to talk about bravery. Bravery isn't being loud or strong all the time. Sometimes it's just telling the truth. Even when your voice shakes. I covered my mouth, overwhelmed. She smiled. My mom taught me that. She's my hero. That night, as I tucked her into bed, she said, Mama, will I be brave when I grow up too? I brushed her hair back and kissed her forehead. You already are, I whispered. Then I added something I wish someone had told me when I was a child. You don't have to be perfect to be brave. You just have to keep showing up, with your whole heart. And with that, the cycle ended. The silence I once lived under was gone. The fear passed down through generations, broken. And in its place, truth, love, and a little girl who knew her worth before the world tried to steal it. One morning, I received a call from a national news channel. They had heard about the foundation, the speeches, the viral story that had quietly touched millions. We'd love to do a feature, the woman on the line said. Your story is inspiring. You've changed lives. I paused for a moment, overwhelmed. Then I said, I'll do it. But I want it to be about more than me. I want it to be about all the women who stood up, quietly, every single day, even when no one clapped. She replied, that's exactly what we want. When the crew arrived at our home, I was nervous. Cameras. Lights. Questions. But the moment they asked, how did it all begin? I knew the answer. I looked into the camera, took a breath, and said, it began the night my father humiliated me in front of 200 people. And it continued the moment my husband stood up for me, when no one else did. But the real story isn't about humiliation, or even heroism. It's about rebuilding. I paused, then added. I thought my life had shattered that night. But what I didn't realize was that I was finally free to start writing my own story. The interview aired 2 weeks later. I didn't expect what came next. Thousands of comments, emails, messages from people I'd never met. Women from small towns. Men who said they saw their wives in me. Mothers, daughters, survivors. Many said the same thing. I thought I was the only one. That line repeated in my head. Again and again. Because that's what pain does, it isolates. But storytelling, it connects. And through this story, through my story, others were finding their own voices. One letter arrived by mail. Handwritten. No return address. Inside was a simple note. I never apologized to my daughter. But because of your story, I called her today for the first time in years. Thank you for helping me remember how to be a father. I read it 3 times. Then I cried. Because sometimes healing doesn't happen where you expect it. And sometimes, the people you don't know become part of your journey anyway. One quiet Saturday, Hope sat at the kitchen table with a brush in her hand and watercolor on her fingertips. What are you painting? I asked. She smiled without looking up. You. I walked closer. She had painted a woman, standing in the middle of a storm. Raindrops, lightning, wind all around her. But the woman stood tall, smiling, holding a small heart in her hands. At the bottom she had written, "My mom. She stands even when it rains." I hugged her tight, tears in my eyes. Because in that moment, I realized she didn't just love me. She understood me. That night, as we cleaned the kitchen, I said to Ethan, "Do you ever think about that night, the dinner?" He paused, then nodded. Sometimes. Not with pain anymore. Just clarity. I asked, "Do you regret speaking up?" He smiled and said, "No. I regret not standing sooner. I regret every moment I let you feel alone before that." I touched his face gently. "You didn't just stand that night," I whispered. "You held me up long before I even knew I was falling." He kissed my forehead. And in his silence, I found peace. As time passed, invitations continued to come. Books. Talks. Panels. People called me a leader. A voice. A survivor. A symbol. But when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see any of those things. I just saw a woman who had once been told she didn't belong in the room. And now, not only did I belong, I built the room. Hope's school called one day. "Mrs. Hale, we're organizing a Parents Who Inspire event. Students will be sharing stories about people who shaped them, and Hope, well, she's written about you." I smiled, though my heart fluttered. Me? An inspiring parent. I had spent years fearing I would repeat the same coldness I grew up with. That I would, somehow, turn out like him. But here I was, being invited because of who I had become, not who I had escaped. I said yes. The auditorium was full, kids, parents, teachers. Ethan sat beside me, holding my hand. Hope walked to the stage with her usual little skip. She wore her favorite yellow dress, and a necklace we made together from old buttons. She reached the microphone, took a breath, and began. "My mom isn't famous. She's not a queen or a superhero. But she is the bravest person I know. When people tried to make her small, she didn't shrink, she grew. When someone told her to leave, she stood up taller. And because of her, I know that my voice matters." She smiled at me through teary eyes. She taught me that kindness is a kind of power, and love is never something you have to earn. You just deserve it, always. The crowd clapped. I cried quietly. That was the moment I realized. She wasn't just my daughter. She was my echo. One rainy afternoon, a package arrived in the mail. No sender listed. Inside was a weathered box. I opened it slowly and found a bundle of old letters. Some written by my father. Some from his own father. Faded military documents. Family photos I'd never seen before. At the bottom was a note, handwritten. From James, I found these while going through his things. Thought you should have them. I think he kept them for you. Love you. I sat on the floor and went through every piece. One letter stopped me. Written in ink, addressed but never sent. Emma. You made your choice. And I never agreed with it. But I see now that you never needed my approval to be strong. Soft, too much or too little. I looked up. To every person who has ever been asked to leave the room. Build your own. Fill it with light. And leave the door open for someone else to walk through. Later that night, I sat on a balcony overlooking a city full of lights. Hope slept in the next room. Ethan brought me tea. We didn't speak for a while. Then I said, it's strange. I used to wish he'd said one kind thing before he died. One final word of love. Ethan looked at me. And now? I smiled. Now I know, it wasn't his words that shaped me. It was my own. After the summit, life returned to its own soft rhythm. Morning coffee. School drop-offs. Garden walks with Hope. Ethan still made pancakes on Sundays, humming that same old tune. There was no spotlight. No applause. And yet, this was the part one loved most. Because peace doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives like this. In stillness. In safety. In a home where no one raises their voice to be heard, because they're already listened to. She was 13 when it happened. A friend at school turned on her. Said something cruel. Spread a lie. Hope came home that day with red eyes and trembling hands. I don't understand, she whispered. I didn't do anything wrong. I sat beside her on the couch, tucked her under my arm, and said, Sweetheart, sometimes people hurt others because they haven't learned how to hold their own pain. She wiped her nose. What did you do when people hurt you? I thought for a moment. I walked away when I needed to, but I also stood tall when I had to. Was it hard? She asked. Yes, I said. But every time I stood, even shaking, I got stronger. That night, I found her writing in her journal. She let me read a page. Just one. It said, I felt small today. But then I remembered that I come from a long line of women who were told to be quiet, and decided not to be. I closed the journal and kissed her head. She didn't need to be told she was brave. She already believed it. 10 years had passed since we opened the Hale Foundation. We had helped thousands of women. Grown from a team of 5 to a team of 50. One afternoon, the staff called me into the main hall. There stood the board of directors, a small stage, and a large portrait of me on the wall. Ethan and Hope were there too. One of our coordinators stepped up to the mic. We wanted to take a moment, she said, to honor the woman who turned her pain into purpose, who built this place with her heart, and who made every one of us feel seen. She handed me a plaque. It read, Emma Hale, founder, fighter, flame. I held it in my hands and looked at the faces around me. Women of all ages. Some survivors. Some still healing. Some just beginning to believe they could start again. And I realized, this wasn't about me anymore. It never really was. That night, I found a letter on my pillow. No name on the front, just a heart, hand-drawn in blue ink. I opened it and read, Emma, you've always thanked me for standing for you. But the truth is, you saved me, too. You made me believe that love didn't have to be loud to be strong. That you didn't have to carry someone else's name with pride, you could build your own. And watching you become everything they said you couldn't be, has been the greatest honor of my life. I'd stand for you 1,000 more times, in 1,000 more rooms. Always. Ethan. I pressed the letter to my chest. Because after all these years, he was still the one who showed up. Not just when things were hard, but every day after. Years later, someone asked me during an interview, "What do you want to be remembered for?" I paused, smiled, and said, "Not for being brave once. Not for one powerful speech or one viral moment. But for the thousands of quiet choices I made afterward, to be kind, to be steady, to be present." I added, "I want my daughter to remember me as someone who never left the room, even when I was asked to. And I want her to know, she never has to wait for someone else to stand for her. She can do it herself. Just like I did." The house was filled with balloons, old photos strung across the walls, and the smell of Ethan's famous chocolate cake baking in the oven. Hope was 18. She stood in the center of the room wearing a white dress her grandmother once gave her, one my mother had kept tucked away all these years. As the guests mingled and music played, I watched her from across the room. Tall, confident, radiant. Someone handed her a mic, asking her to say a few words. She smiled nervously, looked straight at me, and said, "Everything I am today is because someone before me chose to break a cycle. My mom didn't just raise me. She freed me. And one day, I'll raise a daughter too, and she'll never wonder if she's enough. Because I never had to." People clapped. I cried. Because this was the legacy I always wanted to leave. Months later, on a whim, I drove past the house I grew up in. It looked smaller, grayer, almost unfamiliar. The windows were dusty, the hedges overgrown. I parked across the street and just watched for a while. Memories passed through me like ghosts. The staircase where I sat crying after being scolded. The room where I once hid a ribbon I won at school because he called it pointless. But I didn't feel broken. I felt calm. That house didn't own me anymore. It was just bricks. Just walls. Just a place I left behind to build something better. That night, I wrote something for the Foundation newsletter, something I wanted every woman to read who walked through our doors. Dear sister, you may be hurting. Maybe someone you loved told you that you were nothing. That your dreams were silly. That your voice didn't matter. Maybe you were asked to leave the room, just like I was. But here's what I want you to know, when they shut the door, they didn't end your story. They simply gave you the silence you needed to start your own chapter. So take a deep breath. Stand up. And write it, in your own voice, your own way. And if you can't stand just yet, that's okay. I'll stand for you until you can. Love. Emma. One morning, years later, I sat with Ethan on a bench in the same park where we had first dreamed of what life could be. Hope had moved out, college, big plans, a future she owned entirely. The bench was warm from the morning sun. Birds chirped softly above us. We sat in silence, holding hands, watching life go on around us. After a while, Ethan turned and said, "Do you ever think about that dinner?" I smiled gently. "Not like I used to," I said. "It doesn't sting anymore." He nodded. "It changed everything," he added. I looked into his eyes. "No," I said. "We changed everything." At home, on the shelf above the fireplace, sat a book. A memoir. Its spine read, "The Room I Was Asked to Leave, and Why I'm Glad I Did," by Emma Hale. It was filled with stories. Not just mine, but the stories of so many women I'd met along the way. Each chapter ended with a single sentence. You are not alone. Because in the end, that's what mattered most. I never got a picture-perfect ending with my father. No warm hug. No final, I love you. No healing conversation over coffee. But I got something better. I got freedom. Freedom to love deeply. To speak boldly. To live gently. And I got to raise a daughter who would never flinch when someone questioned her worth, because she'd never doubt it. My story didn't begin in victory. It began in silence. In rejection. In pain. But it ended. In love. Years later, I was invited to speak at a special panel on generational strength. But this time, I wasn't the only one on stage. Hope, now in her late 20s, sat beside me, confident, eloquent, and radiant in her own light. We were introduced as the mother and daughter who broke and rebuilt a legacy. The host asked Hope, "How did your mother's story shape your path?" She smiled. "It didn't just shape it, it lit it. My mother taught me that bravery isn't something loud. Sometimes it's sitting in a room where no one believes in you, and choosing to believe in yourself anyway. And that kind of strength echoes for generations." I squeezed her hand. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't just changed my life. I'd changed hers. At the Hale Foundation headquarters, there was a wall called The Room. On it were framed portraits of women who had walked through our doors and stood tall. Teachers, refugees, former inmates, survivors of emotional and physical trauma, women who had been told to sit down and chose to rise instead. I often walked by it quietly, touching the edges of the frames. But one day, I noticed something new. A photo of me, younger, softer, from the early days. And beneath it, someone had written, "The first one who stood." I didn't know who had added it. But I stood there a long time, hand on the glass, heart full of everything I never thought I'd become. In my inbox one evening, I saw a message. Subject, from the granddaughter of someone you once knew. Curious, I opened it. It read, "Dear Mrs. Hale, I don't know if this will matter to you, but I'm the granddaughter of a man named Colonel Richard Hale. He was my grandfather, but I never met him. My father, your brother, spoke of him rarely. Last year, I read your book. I didn't know much about that side of our family's story. But reading your journey, it changed something in me. I'm studying psychology now, because I want to help people break harmful patterns too. Thank you for telling your story. It mattered more than you'll ever know. With respect, Anna Hale." I sat back in my chair, stunned. The ripples never stopped. I had grown older. Slower. Grayer at the temples. But I felt more alive than I did at 20. Ethan and I often sat on the back porch in the evenings, watching the sun sink below the hills. He still called me warrior sometimes, though now it was mostly when I stubbornly tried to carry heavy groceries. Hope visited often, sometimes bringing her own students, girls who reminded me of myself at 16, quiet, curious, full of doubt. And I would tell them the same thing I wish someone had told me back then. You don't need permission to belong. You just need to stop waiting for the wrong people to give it to you. Eventually, I stepped back from public speaking. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because I had said enough. My voice now lived in others. In Hope. In every woman who passed through the room. In every daughter who read my story and decided her ending would be different. I didn't need to stand at a podium anymore. I had already changed the room, from the inside out. One night, I dreamed of my father. Not as the rigid man in uniform, but as a tired, older version of himself. In the dream, we sat on a bench. Quiet. Watching birds. No words. Then he turned to me and asked, "Did you become happy?" I looked at him and said, "Yes. But not because of you, and not in spite of you. I became happy because I stopped waiting for someone else to hand me peace. I gave it to myself." He didn't respond. Just nodded. And then I woke up, heart calm, pillow dry. It didn't matter if the dream was real. Because the answer was. My story didn't end in a single moment. It ended in 1,000 small ones. Laughing with Ethan in the kitchen over burnt toast. Watching Hope teach her first class. Standing in the room, hand on the wall. Sitting in silence and feeling nothing but peace. That's how I knew I had truly healed. Not because I forgot. But because remembering no longer hurt. It was a golden morning, sunlight dripping through the trees, warming the stones of our garden path. Ethan walked slowly beside me, his fingers brushing against mine as we passed blooming lavender and yellow tulips. Hope had planted them. Each one was labeled with a small wooden marker. One of them read, "Bloom where they tried to bury you." Ethan read it aloud with a soft smile. "She gets her stubbornness from you." I laughed. "She gets her loyalty from you." We stopped at a bench shaded by an old willow tree. Ethan sat first, pulling me gently beside him. He looked at me with a quiet thoughtfulness, then said, "You know, we did all right, didn't we?" I leaned my head on his shoulder. "We did more than all right," I said. "We broke the chain." I kept a box in my writing room. It was old, made of cedarwood, the kind that smells like memory. Inside were hundreds of letters. All handwritten. All sent to me by women from around the world. Some were short. "I left today. I'm scared. But I also feel free." Some were long. "My mother silenced me. My husband ignored me. But your story made me realize I still get to write my ending." Some were from daughters. Some from grandmothers. Some from women who never told their truth until they read mine. Every letter was proof. Proof that standing once can help someone else rise forever. In the final years of my public life, I was invited to speak at a university. Not as a keynote. Not even on a stage. Just to sit in a circle with a group of young women studying psychology, leadership, and women's history. They asked me about fame. About pain. About rebuilding. But one girl asked something no one had ever asked before. She said, "If you could speak to the version of you who stood in that banquet hall, frozen, humiliated, what would you say to her?" The question silenced the room. I took a long breath, then answered. I would say, "She doesn't know it yet, but this will be the moment she begins. That one day, the pain she feels will become the story she tells, and that story will set others free." I would say, "Keep walking out of that room. You're walking into your life." On my 65th birthday, Hope stood to give a toast. She was grown now. A woman with her own voice, her own path, her own quiet strength. She looked around the candlelit room and said, "When I was little, I thought my mom was invincible. But when I got older, I realized something even better, she's human. She broke. She rebuilt. And she let me watch the whole thing. She didn't protect me from every sadness, she just showed me how to survive it with grace. And today, I thank her not just for being my mother, but for being my mirror." I wiped my tears as she raised her glass. To the woman who didn't just give me life, she taught me how to live it. One warm summer evening, I sat out on the lawn wrapped in a soft blanket. The sky above me stretched wide and quiet, scattered with stars that shimmered like secrets. Ethan came outside holding 2 mugs of chamomile tea. He placed one in my hands and kissed my forehead. We sat together in silence. Then he whispered, "Do you ever miss the noise?" I shook my head. I never liked the noise. "What do you like?" he asked, gently teasing. I looked at him and answered truthfully, "This. You." Her peace. He nodded. It took a lifetime to get here. Yes, I said. But I'd walk through that dinner again 100 times, just to arrive at this. That night, I opened my oldest journal. The first entry, written in messy, sad handwriting, was from the night of the retirement dinner. It read, "I feel small. I feel erased. I feel like I'm not enough." I turned to the very last page and wrote, "I feel strong. I feel whole. I feel free. I am not a disappointment. I never was. I just stopped looking for applause in rooms I was never meant to stand in." I closed the journal and placed it on my shelf. Not because the story was over, but because it had finally come full circle. I hadn't been to the Hale Foundation in months. Hope had taken on more of the leadership role now, and the team had grown into something bigger than I ever imagined. But one afternoon, I stopped by. Not to lead. Not to speak. Just to walk the halls quietly and watch. I saw a young woman in the art therapy room, painting her pain onto canvas. I saw a volunteer teaching a small group how to write letters they'd never send, letters to the ones who hurt them, to the ones who stayed silent, and even to themselves. And on the wall in the front lobby, someone had added a new quote beneath the foundation's name. "This is the place you walk into when the world told you to leave the room." I stood there and let the words settle into me. Because once upon a time, I was that girl. And now, I was the reason another didn't feel alone. That evening, Hope handed me an envelope at dinner. "No special occasion," she said. "I just wanted to write something down." I opened it slowly. "Mom, I don't think children ever fully understand what their parents survived until they grow up and face the world themselves. I used to think you were just strong. But now I know, you were tired and still chose to love. You were afraid and still chose to show up. You were hurt and still chose to heal. I want you to know that I saw it all. Even when I was too young to name it. And now that I'm older, I only hope I can carry your grace into the lives of others. Thank you for building a life that felt safe to grow up in. I love you. Hope." I folded the letter gently and held it to my heart. It felt like closure, not because something had ended, but because something had lasted. One rainy afternoon, there was a knock on my front door. I opened it to find a woman in her late 40s. She was soaked, nervous, holding a small umbrella, and a book clutched to her chest. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I know this is strange. But, are you Emma Hale?" I nodded, cautious but kind. She smiled, tears rising in her eyes. "I was there that night. The night of the dinner. I was one of the guests. Just a distant cousin of your father's. I barely knew you." I tilted my head, gently curious. "But I've followed your story ever since," she said. "And I want you to know, watching you walk out that night, it changed me." She handed me the book. Inside it was a dedication page. Asterisk to the woman who stood tall when silence was easier. "You taught me how to write without fear." Asterisk. She was an author now. I hugged her. Sometimes, the seeds you plant in silence grow in places you never expect. Years later, in my final public letter, published online, in newspapers, and on the Foundation's website, I wrote, "To the girl who feels forgotten. To the woman who has been told she's too much or not enough. To the child who is waiting for someone to say, 'I'm proud of you.' To the person sitting in the back of the room wondering if they belong. You do. Asterisk, you've always belonged. Even if they couldn't see it, even if they made you leave, even if they said you weren't worth the seat, you are, asterisk. You don't have to wait for permission to shine. And if you need a sign, this is it." One evening, as Ethan and I sat by the fire, white hairs on his temples, laugh lines deeper now, he turned to me and said, "Do you ever wish you could go back and change anything?" I thought about it. The shame. The silence. The moment I stood frozen while my father erased me in front of a crowd. And then I shook my head. No, I said. Because I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been there first. He smiled and leaned over to kiss my cheek. I'm glad you were brave. I leaned against him. I'm glad you saw me when no one else did. I had a favorite spot in the garden, under the cherry blossom tree Ethan planted on our 10th anniversary. It was a quiet bench tucked between rose bushes and winding ivy. A place where time softened and memories came gently. One morning, I sat there alone with a warm scarf, a journal on my lap, and sunlight glinting through the pink petals above. Hope had just left for a trip overseas, her first solo speaking tour. Before leaving, she hugged me and said, "Every time I walk on stage, I hear your voice in my head." I smiled at the thought. Under the blossoms, I wrote. She was born from the moment I stood. Not just my daughter but my future. My legacy isn't a monument. It's a ripple. A breath passed from woman to woman, through truth and tenderness. My 70th birthday. Hope insisted on throwing a small party, nothing too big, just a few close friends, former foundation team members and family. Ethan arranged the whole thing under the cherry blossom tree. Twinkling fairy lights. Mason jars of wildflowers. A wooden sign that read, "You stood. So we could rise." At one point, everyone gathered around, holding candles. Hope raised hers first. This is for the woman who taught me how to stay soft in a world that tried to harden her. Others followed. For the one who taught me I didn't have to earn kindness. For the one who made space for stories like mine. For the one who stood up and let the rest of us believe we could, too. I wept, not from sadness but from fullness. Because in the end, I didn't need millions to know my name. I just needed these few to carry it with love. One day, I returned to the old hall where my father's retirement dinner had been held. It had been decades. The building was different now, converted into a community space. A library on one side. A small theater in the back. I walked through the hallway and found the room. Empty. Echoing. Soft light from tall windows. I stood at the same spot where I had once been humiliated. Where my world seemed to collapse. But now, I was not that girl anymore. I walked to the center, closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you. Not for the pain. But for the permission I gave myself, after you took yours away." Then I turned and walked out. But this time, I walked tall. Years later, a documentary was made about the foundation. It featured many stories, not just mine. But the title surprised me. The room she walked out of, how one woman made space for thousands. It aired across platforms. Letters came in again. Young people who hadn't been born when the dinner happened reached out with stories of how they found courage in a stranger's quiet decision to walk away. A decision that echoed through lives they didn't even know were connected. That night, Ethan turned to me and said, "You never imagined all this, did you?" "No," I whispered. "But I hoped for it. Eventually, I knew I would leave this world. But I didn't want my last words to be about goodbye. So I wrote a letter. And tucked it inside a journal labeled simply, 'To her.' It was for Hope. My darling girl. By the time you read this, I hope you already know everything I'm about to say. But in case there's any doubt, you were the light I didn't know I needed. You were the proof that breaking a pattern could build something unshakable. You are, and always have been, my greatest poem. Live loud. Live slow. Live honest. And when the world tries to quiet you, let your story speak. You don't carry my burden. You carry my flame. Love. Mom. Hope had a daughter now. Her name was Lily. She had my chin, Ethan's thoughtful eyes, and her mother's laugh, loud, contagious, full of wonder. She was 5 when she asked the first question. "Grandma, were you always brave?" I smiled and shook my head. "No, sweet pea. I had to practice." She frowned, tilting her head. "Like with piano?" "Exactly like piano," I laughed. "Sometimes I missed notes. Sometimes I cried. But I kept playing." She thought for a second, then asked, "Did you win?" I looked her in the eyes and said, "Yes. Because I never stopped singing my own song." Years later, after I was gone, Hope sat in my writing room, quiet, the same way I used to sit there when the world outside was too loud. She held the journal with the letter inside. She opened it slowly, her hands shaking, and began to read. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she didn't sob. Because the words didn't ache. They held her. They wrapped around her like arms. She closed the journal, placed it on her lap, and whispered, "Thank you." Hope added something new to the Hale Foundation's entrance hall. A curved wall, etched with the names of women who had changed lives, mothers, daughters, caretakers, fighters. In the center, one name was carved slightly larger than the others. Emma Hale. She stood, and we followed the light. Visitors came from all over. Teenagers who had never met me. Elders who still remembered the speech. Strangers who carried stories they hadn't told anyone, until they stood in that room. They read my name. And something inside them lifted. One afternoon, Lily discovered something in Hope's bookshelf. A small audio player labeled "For Her." She pressed play. My voice came through, older, softer, but still clear. "If you're listening to this, then maybe the world feels loud. Or unfair. Or confusing. Maybe. Someone told you to stay quiet. Or small. Or still. But I want you to know, your voice is not noise. It's music. Your presence is not too much. It's exactly what this world needs. And if you ever doubt that, listen again." Lily sat still for a long time. Then she pressed play one more time. And again. And again. In a city I had never visited, in a bookstore I'd never seen, a young woman pulled my memoir from a shelf. She read the title aloud. The room I was asked to leave. She held it close. And something, a pain she hadn't known how to name, began to shift. She bought it. Took it home. Highlighted every line that made her feel less alone. And when she reached the final page, she whispered, "I will not shrink anymore." And in that whisper, my story lived again. There comes a time when a story no longer needs to be told. Not because it ends, but because it becomes part of the air. The way people speak to their daughters. The way women walk into rooms with their heads held higher. The way one person standing tall helps another rise. I had been erased once. But I was never truly gone. Because you cannot erase a story that keeps being written in the lives of others. If you remember nothing else about me, remember this. I was not fearless. I was not perfect. I was not unbreakable. But I was willing. Willing to walk out. Willing to begin again. Willing to be seen, even when it hurt. And in that willingness, I found the one thing I was never given but always deserved. Freedom.